This is the tech tip video for the rear pod and pivot build of the X12-22. So that's the first part that I'm gonna build of the rear suspension. And which parts do we need to put this together? We need the side braces first, which I'm gonna assemble. I'm gonna put the pivot balls inside of them. And we have these little 2.5mm screws, which they hold the pivot balls in place. You can look out for these screws. They are the smallest screws that come in this bag. So these balls, they just pop into the side tubes like this. You can just push them in with your fingers. You don't need to use the multi-tool or anything. Because these side links, they're very flexible, so the balls just pop into place without much force. And then we're gonna put these 2.5mm screws here to hold these pivot balls in place. Okay, here it's important to not over tighten these screws because you don't want to bind up the pivot balls. Just put this snugly in there, but not too far so that you bind things up. These should be able to move freely under all circumstances. So it's actually better to have a little bit of play than to have any binding here. So a bit of play doesn't hurt. It's always better than to have a bound up suspension. Alright, that screw is in there. It's moving freely. We're going to repeat this for the other side. Two side links here. Okay, the side links are done. We can then proceed to installing these onto the chassis. I'm gonna use these countersunk screws for that. Okay, so you have two options here to mount the side links. You have the inner hole and the outer hole. So the two options for the side links, they can change the handling of the car. So if you use the inside position for the side link, you're gonna have a lot of angle to the side link towards the rear. This angle helps to generate more mid-corner steering. It's also referred to as rear steer. So the rear of the car will actually have a bit of a steering effect, so to speak, in the middle of the corner, which makes the car more aggressive and gives it more steering. This effect can also be further increased by adding shims between the chassis and the side link. So usually in the range of 0 to 1.5mm, which is not as strong of an effect as the angle of the side link. It's more of a subtle effect, but this can really help to fine-tune the feeling of the car. The initial setting, however, is the outer hole. which I'm going to install the side links into. Make sure you tighten these well so that they don't come loose during racing. Okay. So we then continue with the rear pod plate. Looks like this. To the rear pod plate, we're gonna install the rear part of the pivot. I'm going to use the short ball stud with a 1mm shim on it, which is the initial setting. So 1mm is the initial setting, which I already have installed here on my race car, which is built. And you have the option here to move the pivot forward. So instead of using 1mm shim here, you can use 3mm. And for that reason, we have 2 holes here on the chassis, so you can shift the pivot forward and by 2mm, which will affect the handling of the car in a way where you can generate more grip, you can get more rear traction by having the pivot more forward. But for most conditions, we prefer to run the pivot in the rearward position. I'm gonna install the pivot here to the chassis. It is obviously sitting super low on the chassis. The roll center is very low on this particular car. And this is something that we incorporated into the car because of the solid axle in the rear now being the trend for most conditions. And the solid axle really works well with a lower roll center in the center pivot. But this can be adjusted with shims. You can raise and lower the roll center by adding shims under the pivot. You have to add it both here and to the mounting point on the main chassis as well, of course. And that's usually within the range of 0 to 2mm. So the kit basic setting is no shims underneath. But if you need to raise the roll center to free up the car and to get less rear traction, add shims under the pivot, on the rear pod, and on the chassis. Okay, let's then install the center pivot. If you have tread lock, I recommend adding tread lock to this screw here, so that it doesn't come loose. And then the little bushing. When you install this bushing, make sure that flat spot is pointing downwards here. Push it in place. You can remove the little excess mold here. And then we mount this onto the chassis here. As I said, this screw here, I prefer to add a bit of tread lock to it, so you should do that when you assemble the car. This screw is used to adjust the play of the pivot ball. The ball slot goes into the center pivot. So for example, when the center pivot gets worn, you can You can tighten that screw to reduce the play. But like I mentioned before, it's always better to have a bit of play rather than having a binding suspension. We tighten these screws here in the rearward suspension, in the rearward hole for the center pivot mounting position. Just gonna leave this screw loose for now. And install this here onto the chassis. We'll grab these screws for the side links and for the rear pod bulkheads, which I'm going to install in a minute. Okay, so let's install the side links here to the rear pod. Tighten these well so that they don't come loose. And these screws here. That's all together. So as you can see on the center pivot on this car is moving completely freely in all directions. It doesn't bind up like it did on the previous types of rear pivot. But again, just make sure that everything is moving freely. There should be a slight amount of play here rather than binding. And everything's ready to go. We then move on to the rear pod, which is a very, very important part of the car, so we need to pay attention to the build here to have the best possible performance. So we're going to install these bulkheads to the rear pod, which they are now pinned. They have centering pins on them, so they're held in place for better rigidity, for reduced flex, and for better durability and resistance to tweak in a crash. So put these screws in here, but we're not going to tighten them down fully just yet because we're going to put the whole assembly together first. So just don't over tighten them, just put them in there for now. Put the other one on the other side. And we tighten these screws here. Again, don't over tighten these. Don't tighten these, just put them in there for now and wait till everything is put together when I install the rear brace. With 4 screws in the back. Again, just install these screws to line everything up before you tighten it down. It's important here to tighten these in the right order, otherwise you might put some tweak into the rear pod assembly. If you have a big crash, it's important to take this apart and make sure that there's no binding or tweak happening in the rear pod. So take the pod apart, loosen all the screws, make sure there's no tension in any of the parts. Okay, so then we continue by tightening these bulkheads down while holding the pod and the bulkhead with your two fingers. Push them together. Push them together as you tighten these screws down to make sure that everything is flat. Done. And then you put the pod on the setup board. Push this down with your fingers like this while you tighten these screws down from the rear brace. It's very important to do this in a precise manner so that everything is flat. Check that these are nice and tight. And that's all put together, everything moving freely, everything is nice and flat. And that concludes the tech tip video for the rear pod and pivot build.